You are listening to Level Up Your Gaming Podcast, episode 116, Basing Games on Established Stories. In today's episode, we discuss basing games on established stories from video games and movies. We discuss how much material to adapt and what to avoid. If you'd like to participate in the discussion or leave us feedback, you can contact us at levelupyourgamingpodcast@gmail.com or find us on Facebook at facebook.com/levelupyourgaming. If you like the content and want to hear more of the show, subscribe and we'll ensure you don't miss an episode. New episodes come out almost every Wednesday. Also, please review, tell a friend about the podcast, or share with your gaming group. Now sit back and enjoy the episode. Welcome into the Level Up Your Gaming Podcast. My name is Aaron, and joining me this week, GM Tom.
Hello.
Hi, Tom. So anyways, this is going to be Tom's first episode. This is the update that I've got for you guys here. We gave him the introduction episode, if you listen to that. Otherwise, go back and listen to the last episode, which will be Tom's introduction episode. I'm also going to be reaching out to Josh, Ken, and Lori for other rotating co-hosts. Tom's a great guy, but Tom can't be here every week, unfortunately.
Oh no, I can't.
You've got
my wife would
life.
kill me.
Yeah, you've got a wife, you got a dog. I mean, it'd be tough.
Yeah, it'd be rough.
But no, that's all the updates that we have for the show. So we're gonna go into the topic at hand, which is basing your games on established stories. And I've thought about talking about this with Jared. We never got around to doing the episode, but now that I've got Tom here, this is a great one because I know that you have successfully adapted some video games and other stuff into stories. I have found it to be, I guess, more lackluster of an endeavor, but I'll let you kind of give me your 2 cents on, or I guess your thoughts initially on adapting a video game.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Adapting like a video game or a movie or a book or anything kind of, already in existence into your game, it's a good source material to work from, but you do have to watch out when you do it because you don't want to be telling the exact same story that they were telling, because if your players are familiar with the story, they're, why don't I just read the book, or why don't I just watch the movie? Or like, I played this game. It's like, I already know what's going to happen. So you can't go exact. And you also have to read your audience very well if you're going to be doing something like that. If your players are familiar with the source material, well, then don't try to sneak around and make them like not realize it, because once they catch on, then you're kind of out of luck really for telling your story, and then you're gonna get a train wreck real fast. But if they aren't familiar with the source material, well, you can get a little closer to it, sure, if you want, and then you could even tell them, oh, this is where I pulled it from, if you want to delve into it more. But you have to be careful when you're covering something like that, but it can give you a lot of great inspiration. A good example of a game that I ran that way was something based off of a video game, Shin Megami Tensei Devil Survivor. If you've ever played any of the Shin Megami Tensei games, you know that they're amazing. Atlas truly puts out some good product between those, Persona, and all the other games that they have. But anywho, I digress. What you can do, though, whenever you have something like that, is you pull up some core concepts from it, or something that really did pull at your heartstrings for why you were excited about it.
So was it the story element of the end of the world and becoming a god, or was it the spoiler? I should have put a spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert! God, now no one's gonna play that game.
Yeah, if you haven't already played it, I mean,
it was modern times, and it did involve a post-apocalyptic. Actually, it was not post-apocalyptic, to be honest. It was very much of it is creeping up on you. They didn't actually go. Well, I mean, they did get to the post-apocalyptic, and that was the end of the game because they, became like the devil, and could control humanity and That's a pretty good stopping point. I don't think you can go much, go anywhere from there.
There's a limit to how far you can take that that story. It's once your players become that's always a problem. This is an aside from the topic we're talking about here, which is once your players achieve a certain power level, it's almost impossible to continue a game because it's just like
well, and think about that for like TV series are always a big one for that is they come across some great story arc or something that they built up for so long, and then they're like, well, we're making a lot of money with this. Let's do another season. I know, we can undo everything we just did with our epic storytelling and reinvent all these characters that were built up to be excellent or villains or whatnot.
But that's a problem with American TV and syndication.
It is a problem with American TV, but it's also a problem in your games if you do things like that. Once you reach certain points where you've told a complete story, it's okay to set that story down and pick up a new story.
Yes, I agree that once you've hit the culmination of your long overarching story, you should say, that is it. These characters are now retired. They fade into the distance, and we will now tell a new story. Or if you are chronicling and kind of doing something more episodic, that story ends. The players go on to pick up a new story. But at the same time, you have to scale powers to match up with your players, and the journey to get to where you are is generally more rewarding than just being super powerful at the start.
Oh, yeah. To be honest, I'm normally not excited about being very powerful. I prefer the journey. I prefer to be the underdog in most scenarios than to have all these superpowers or, disciplines above 5. Or like, I've got Arte 7 now. I can reshape reality.
But no, it's an interesting... So you were able to adapt that game successfully. Now, did anybody know? Now, did you take any other elements from it? Like, obviously, there's sort of like a Pokemon-esque element to the Shin Megami Tensei series, which is combining the demons.
That I did not do.
Okay.
So with that system, they all had their unique power. I introduced them to the concept as though they were making superheroes or supervillains. Like, what kind of superpower would you like to have? You'll be shocked to find out what system I used. But they were like, I want my person to be able to manipulate fire, or I want to have some luck management or time or whatnot. And they paired up with demons in this game to grant them those powers. And so they had to form contracts with that specific entity to do what they wanted to do.
Got it.
And so they could talk with it and whatnot, and it worked like a familiar, but it gave them the ability to do what they wanted.
So it was the source of their powers, not that they were collecting demons to amass.
Yeah, they were not doing that. Yeah, no. My experience with having NPCs as a support for your character, like, if you want to have like your bear as a druid or whatnot, or anything to that extent, is in small doses it can work. But when that becomes the highlight of it, it's very much you're telling yourself things, or like the players are just acting out what their little minion would do, and that cuts into their being heroic. So it's good to have them there. You want to know that they're involved, but that should never take away from what the players are doing. So it's always a balancing act, but that's also another topic. Is too many NPCs spoil the pot, or like having,
they should never become the main focal of your story. That's
no. that just doesn't work well.
So did anyone? You obviously used a fairly well-known video game for that. Did anyone sort of know the source material, and did that ruin any of the...
It did not. The reason it also did not is because I pulled from a second source, being Groundhog's Day. So and that one I played into. So when you're pulling into a story that is fairly well known, especially, you can either swing towards it and let them clearly know that this is going to be an element of the story, Or, if you don't think they'll know about it, then you can kind of hide away. So I hid away from the Shin Megami aspect of it, and I swung towards the repeating time to progress your story element of it.
Was this the one where they had the notebook?
They did have a notebook. And the notebook, literally, I wrote out what they did, what they experienced for every day. So any person could pick up this notebook and read about their previous exploits, which if people had hidden secrets or hidden agendas, that would be written down in this notebook. No one bothered to pick up the notebook, but they did realize that that's how many lives they had, because every time I would fill in a page, that's one less page you have in this notebook. And if you wanted to form like extra contracts or whatnot with various evil entities, that would be ripped out of your notebook pages. So to form the contract, because it was the thing that was giving them a lot of this, but it also gave them kind of the knowledge to deal with a lot of these threats in the Shin Megami universe. Is like, oh man, this is gonna murder us. Anyone familiar with the game Wendigo? He was a rough first guy to come across. You're like, oh man, we got murdered. Belder, what's this guy? So it helped convey that story, but it kept it far enough away from the source material that it did fly under the radar for my players. So it felt nice.
Okay, interesting. Again, I've tried to, and again, maybe my adaptations have not been as strong. I tried to do more of a Resident Evil-y type feel.
I love zombies.
But the execution of it was poor because, obviously in Resident Evil you need to get the sprayed key, and the sprayed key does and so like that doesn't translate well into a gaming situation, because obviously there's a aspect of your players need to have the autonomy to try to figure out, or at least the illusion of choice, to figure out the solution in front of them.
Well, think about using Resident Evil as an example for this. Is finding the spade key or figuring out what pieces you need to form the lock to open this elevator or door or whatever the part you remember from Resident Evil? For me, it's the subterfuge of the different NPCs that come across you, or the crazy like genetically mutated zombies you have to deal with, or some of the environments can be kind of cool. Like I do love the whole secret lab under a mansion or under an elevator or in the sewers. God, they put secret labs everywhere. You can't lift a rock without coming up.
Listen, if you're the Umbrella Corporation and you don't have a secret lab.
Seriously, they're very much like G.I. Joe Cobra, where like they put their hideouts everywhere. So, but that is the part that I really enjoy with it, is you slowly uncover the connection from where you are to where the threat is, or where all the crazy stuff is happening.
So it's like the tone that you want to adapt more so than the specific elements of the game.
Yeah, I would say for that one, that's how I would try to convey it. You could even have built-in puzzles, because I do enjoy puzzles myself in a game. Those are sometimes harder to do, but you have to pull like a couple of points from your source material that'll still keep it true, or true to what you're trying to convey. But yeah, you can't tell the exact story. Like, you can't be like, okay, you guys have just dodged a semi-truck that exploded. One of you's on one side of the semi-truck, one of you the other. Now you know there's a police station nearby. Where are you gonna go? like, am I gonna stop at a weapon shop and come across some guy who wields a shotgun and gets eaten by zombies? I mean, probably at that point.
I mean, if we're gonna make it that blatantly obvious,
then you roll into it, right? If your players know that, then you make it super campy, like from something like that. I mean, zombies are zombies; they're fun and all, but they're kind of, they move one direction and eat your brains, So like, have some fun with it. If you want to do a more horror vibe, well, then now you're probably talking more like the threat is there, and it's insurmountable. So you probably don't want to pull like so close to the source material that they already know what's going to happen, but close enough that they know kind of like what's the vibe that they're going to get, and maybe tell your own story within Raccoon City for this one, for how you're going to connect to an umbrella, or however it is your equivalent.
Got it. No, that makes sense. It seems like there's a good delineation between the adaptation of like going really, really. I've never found leaning deep into it works. Maybe that's a player issue where like I'm not telling it to the right players who would lean into that.
Yeah, and obviously you need to know your audience very well. So if you're going to be telling a zombie story, are your people going to be serious about the zombies? Are they going to be more because I know some people will be super excited about, what's your plan for the zombie apocalypse? Oh, I'm going to get my truck, and then I know that I need to go to the survival store. So there's a Dick's Sporting Goods that's 3.8 miles from my place. Once I gear up there, then I'm going to take a motorcycle off to this place, avoiding major roadways, and then we're going to be doing that. And, some people really like that and kind of plan for how their characters will survive the zombie apocalypse. And you know what? That's a good story even to work from for there. But you need to know beforehand that those are the kind of players you're going to be having. So that's going to be the way you need your story to be working.
Yeah, so you couldn't tell the totally campy story if you have the player that's going to do that.
Yes.
Okay.
And a lot of that should be knowing your players before this this point. I've never been on this podcast, but I've heard what is it? Know your players. So
KYP. Yeah. I'm a firm believer of that, but also if you don't know them, you probably wouldn't start with a video game based story.
No, because once again, you either have to lean into it or lean away from it, right? So if you are very close to source material and you don't know who you're going to be running for, it's going to be impossible for you to know what they know and what they don't know. So it's just not going to work. I mean, unless you just got a really lucky group and you just happen to come across people who will match up for that, then that's great. But odds are not in your favor. You're setting yourself up for failure at that point.
So how would you say that it's different when you're trying to adapt a movie, or is it the same concept that you're working with?
The only real difference comes from the amount of content that's provided between a video game, a movie, and like a television series or a book. More source material does give you a lot more flexibility, and would probably make for more of like a longer campaign than like a movie would tell. Sure. But honestly, if you're pulling from it concepts, you can really wrap your concept however you want. Going back to like the Shin Megami idea, yeah, it's post-apocalyptic, the city's burning and being destroyed and overrun from monsters or whatever. You can carry that a completely different direction. You don't have to be in a city. You could be, in the country, and you didn't even hear about this until all of a sudden this thing's on your doorstep. And then now you people have to bind together as a community or whatnot. It's a completely different telling of that story from a different perspective, and you could maybe build it a little longer. But notice that I'm putting more separation between myself and the source material just by doing that. If you're going to pull a longer campaign, you need to give yourself more wiggle room. If you're pulling super close to a story, then, well, those stories were told for X amount of time. So trying to pull well past that amount is pulling past the expiration date, and then you're going to have some sour milk.
Makes sense. That makes sense. So I guess we sort of touched on it, but I mean, aside from some of the stuff that maybe makes it too campy, unless you're going to lean into that, what else do you exclude from the story itself?
Minutia is the thing to always avoid. So having to do trivial tasks to further your own story. Now, if it is for a purpose, sure, go ahead and add it in there. But you need to make certain that every action you're doing is furthering the story or maybe adding more mystery to it, developing some of the people involved, the players themselves, the NPCs. You know, you just have to focus on what matters and less about what is there to add playtime or what's there to add an extra half an hour from camera panning views.
What are you talking about? You don't want to just go on the journey like they did in Lord of the Rings? Or
Oh,
like
yeah. You know,
the beautiful shots of New Zealand. And
yeah, it's amazing. You had 3 movies for 3 books, and then you had 3 movies for 1 book that's like a fraction of the size of any of the other books. And man, were there a lot of camera shots of just panning around and all the walking scenes. Yeah, no, that was pretty terrible. In my very biased opinion.
But I mean, again, I guess that you always want to try to exclude.
Yeah, you want to exclude mundane things, but you don't want to pull so much from your source material. So limit yourself to a couple of points. But the core concepts.
Would you ever pull NPCs from the source material into the game?
You can absolutely pull them. Don't call them the same name, though. Unless you're leaning into campy. But you can pull NPCs if there's somebody who like really shined for you and you thought like was a good concept. Like going into the Resident Evil example, Ada Wong. She shows up like all the time in those games, and she's always up to something not very good, and she's super sneaky, super stealthy, great at murdering, a great spy. I mean, that's a character you can really roll with. So adapt that character. There's nothing that's really wrong with doing that. I would never call them Ada Wong, and well, mostly because that's a horrible name to begin with. But anyway, I got a little sidetracked on that one. But it's fine to pull some of those characters, and in fact, it can help your characters relate to the story you're telling. Even as something as simple as having an NPC that they can identify as, it puts everyone on point for understanding like what that person's like. I mean, you can even describe an NPC in a game not related to the actual like piece you're from. Like if you have a person like Indiana Jones as an example, everyone's got the idea of Indiana Jones like embedded in their subconscious. Like, so you can absolutely have that kind of adventurer, Tomb Raider kind of guy in almost any universe. And everyone will know what that person is like, and so they can identify with them, and sometimes that can really help get your players on board with the story, because if they're going to be traveling with Indiana Jones, that means they're going to be doing things like Indiana Jones.
So it's more about the experience there. One of the things I'm trying to understand is about avoiding things within the stories itself, like that you end up adapting. So I guess would you probably avoid doing NPCs that were pivotal to that story?
Yes. The NPCs, even if you pulled somebody like an Indiana Jones into your story, they're still an NPC. So your players should become that role if that's what they want to do, which they probably do if you're introducing someone like that into it. But you're using that NPC to bridge the gap into where you want your players to go into. So if you want your players, let's say, looking through subterranean tombs in a lost civilization that they've never been to and it's super foreign to them, well, you start them with an explorer kind of guy who is that kind of person, so they can start emulating that kind of person.
Like you did it with our 7C game. I see what you're doing.
Yeah, you see what I'm doing right there? Your players, if they feel kinship towards an NPC, it is very often that they will try to emulate or expand upon the idea. So, plus, you're building your story around a concept to begin with, so they should already be kind of on board. But having those NPCs who really fill that role, like the James Bond kind of character, the Indiana Jones kind of character, helps your players pass into those positions.
It's an interesting point to use the NPC like sort of like Indiana Jones passing the torch on to the players, or the James Bond passing the torch on to the players. So you become the spies in the James Bond story versus you are moving alongside James Bond.
Exactly. And it's very easy for you to have an introduction story where you are right by James Bond. But James Bond's only one person. He can only go to so many places. And, there's a lot of stuff going on. So your players will now have to, carry on where James Bond could not, because James Bond has to do XYZ things while you people are doing, MNO things. And yeah, you can even come back to him at a later date. And that'll be kind of nice too, because it gives the players a chance to even tell him about oh, these are some of the things we did. Isn't it so cool?
No, I think from a lot of people who do play games, people try to adapt a lot of their source material from other things. Even Jared, when I played in his games, he adapted source material from movies he watched that gave him inspiration for stuff that he ended up doing in the games. So what are some other things that you've seen people do, or maybe you've done yourself, that you would probably say okay, that was a big flop, just do not do that?
So biggest problem I've come across when adapting for myself was swinging towards when I should swing away, and vice versa. Not reading my audience enough, or not knowing them well enough that I conveyed the wrong story for them. When you pull so much from one source, and honestly, I try to pull from multiple sources to help mitigate this fact, but if you pull way too much from one source material, then you are rehashing a story that someone else has already told, and it can just get very blasé very fast. Also, it can make you less inspired to tell it, as well as the players being less inspired to run through it because they've already done this thing. So you can't harp too much on your content. You need to use your content as a basis to build your world from, but it can't be your world unless if you're really swinging into it for a campy, funny kind of group. But if you want to have a more serious group, then you need to be in your story. You can't use it as a surrogate, because then what are you doing?
You're just cannibalizing someone else's
story. You need to have that inspiration that you're telling your own story. But it is good to use as references to come from. So always just pulling too much content from it is going to cause a problem, unless if that's what you're trying to do. But for the most part, it's just a bad idea if you pull too much. So like I said, for that one that we started off with, is I really only pulled, like I said, 2 concepts from it, really. I mean, there's demons that you form contracts with, and it's happening while the world is starting to end. And that's pretty much what I pulled from it. So it gave a good basis, but it was still very much my own story. And the players could build up however they wanted to. We ended up having one of them work with angels, another one work to become a demon, and the other 2 were kind of just helping the other ones out, although they were both being super secretive about it and not wanting anyone else to know, because that could be risky. It's never trust your other teammates.
No, that's a very, very interesting point. It seems like the best way, or the best success you'd get out of it in general, is going to be taking some themes or concepts from the movie or game and then building a story around those themes and concepts, more so than grabbing major plot elements and pieces from a story or a game or movie and then trying to put that into a game.
I would agree with that, especially if you're trying to pull a major plot point. They got to that plot point by doing very specific things. And so if you're trying to get to the same plot point that they're getting to, you're also going to have to do very similar things to get to that spot. And that's just going to force you down a very narrow path of storytelling. And if there's anything I've ever learned of storytelling, it's that you can't predict what your players are going to do. And so trying to force them on a tightrope is a risky way of storytelling, unless if you want a very linear story.
Again, the only stories that I've ever seen sort of work out that way are stories that are very, very short.
Yeah.
And direct.
Well, I mean, thinking about it,
even then, there's a lot of freedom in those stories.
Oh, absolutely. Unless if you're like, there's a number of stories where it's like you play out of the box, like especially like D&D stories. There's a lot of them that, man, there's a lot of undead by these villages with this cleric. Speaking about Ravenloft, it's like you can't flip a rock without a ghoul coming out at you in that universe. But some of those stories can be very good, but because it's already pre-printed, it is going to be, by matter of fact, a very linear story.
When you get into like a module like that, I think it's different than trying to effectively. If I made the module called Lord of the Rings and you played it, it would probably work because it is built to kind of give the players the right options and sort of corral them into the right choices.
Yes, but if you called that, Kings of the Square, then I mean, if people know what it's going to be, then if they knew it beforehand and they were excited about the concept, you're golden. But if they didn't know about the concept and they realized it partway through, then they're going to think you're half-assing your story.
That's a good point. Yeah.
so like, it's fine if you lean into it in that regard for a module, but if you're telling a very linear story, you need to really harp on that. But if you're not telling a linear story and you want to give your people some flexibility, focusing on major plot points for where you're pulling from, while it's possible to work, I'm never going to say it's not going to work, but it is putting the odds against you a little bit.
I feel like you really have to have a table who is going to lean into everything you want to do to make that work.
Yeah. Well, and think about it. What's that one storytelling game that you talked about that it was your action heroes?
Like, oh, the 80s action heroes.
Yeah, the 80s action hero.
Yeah, for the hybrid game system.
Yeah. So, I mean, something like that, you could absolutely pull your major plot points in and be completely fine because the characters are literally action heroes.
The characters are literally mashes of all their 80s action stars into one action person.
Yeah. And then...
So when the Predator comes up and somebody's playing Arnold Schwarzenegger, I forgot the fake Arnold Schwarzenegger name because it was like it was like a mismatch of all of his character names put together. So yeah, it's just like one of those like it's like Dylan from the Predator. It was like Dylan. Apollo Creed something. it was like the most ridiculous name, and it was just all of his combinations put together. So
very nice.
But yeah, no, it's fun stuff. Do you have anything else that you want to add to the episode here? Anything other points you want to bring up, or
for this one, if you are going to really focus on source material for your game, just think about the setting and the system you're going to be using as well for that game. Like Seven Seas is a great example for that. I mean, that system literally tells people that you're Zorro or that you're the Three Musketeers. I mean, it flat out goes that way. So pick a system that will make your players feel that that's acceptable, or that that's what they could be doing if they really wanted to be doing it. But if you do one that's maybe a little more ambiguous, then unless if they design their characters with that in mind, it just may not work the way you intend it. Unless if you're very willing to bend rules to make it so it works.
Dude, you may have to in this case.
You may have to if that's what you want to do. Like if you're running a D&D class-based system where really once you get your skills in place, you don't get a lot of adjustments or corrections for that system. Well, then maybe you shouldn't be telling a Star Wars game based off of that. I mean, heck, there's already a Star Wars system out there, so why wouldn't you be? But you get the idea as an example. Play to the strengths of where you're going to be working in to tell the story that you want based off the source material you got.
There we go. Also, a little foreshadowing into another episode I'm probably going to do with Tom.
Yeah, sorry, I do that.
And that might be foreshadowing into another episode about foreshadowing. So
I love foreshadowing.
But anyways, that's gonna wrap up this episode topic for us. If you got your thoughts on adapting source material, if you've ever done it, if you got your own tips and tricks, things that maybe didn't work out for you, levelupyourgamingpodcast@gmail.com or facebook.com/levelupyourgaming. We are also on YouTube, so go ahead and smash that like button and review the podcast, subscribe to the podcast, share it with a friend. But that's going to wrap us up for the week. So for Tom, I'm Aaron. Have a great week, everyone.
Goodbye, everybody.